They sing of Viking glory, of longships slicing through black water, of warriors with iron axes and hearts carved from winter. The sagas praise their courage, their victories, their relentless hunger for new lands. But beneath the thunder of war drums and the smoke of burning villages lies a silence far heavier than any sword. A silence so deliberate, so ancient, that even time hesitated to disturb it. This is the silence of noble women, queens, princesses, abbesses, and daughters of rulers, whose lives were shattered not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet that followed it. When Viking war bands stormed a kingdom, chroniclers recorded only the clash of steel and the plunder of gold. They rarely wrote a single name of the women carried away. No screams, no final prayers, no trace of the lives they once commanded. Just a cold, indifferent line. A great number of women were taken. But buried beneath these empty words lies a truth sharper than any blade. Women were the real currency of conquest, not merely captives but strategies, bargaining chips, symbols of dominance, and the foundation stones of entire new societies. Their stories were scattered across monasteries, locked inside sagas, lost in unmarked graves, and whispered through the DNA of nations. Today, those fragments gather again, forming a tale powerful enough to reshape the Viking Age itself. Because history remembers the conquerors. But this story remembers the conquered. Before the longships touched a single shore, before fire swallowed monasteries and kingdoms bent under the weight of iron, there existed a law older than any Viking king, the law of silence. Not written in runes or carved in oak, but carried in the hands of every raider who stepped onto foreign soil. It was an unspoken rule. What happened to noble women after conquest was never to be recorded in full. Chroniclers wrote of battles, of heroes, of treasures weighed in silver. They praised the courage of men and the wrath of gods. Yet when it came to the queens, the abbesses, the royal daughters torn from their lineage, the ink ran suddenly thin. Their fates vanished into vague sentences. Women were taken, hostages were seized, captives were carried away. Behind these cold phrases lay storms of fear, power, and forced transformation that reshaped entire nations. This silence was not a mistake, it was a system. To the Vikings, noble women were assets, not stories. Their names carried political weight, their bodies held symbolic value. A princess could buy peace between kingdoms. An abbess could bring knowledge, literacy, or ransom. A queen could shift alliances simply by being claimed. And because their power was valuable, their experience was hidden, erased from chronicles, minimized in sagas, and buried beneath centuries of myth-making. The law of silence protected the conqueror and erased the conquered. It allowed kingdoms to rise without acknowledging the cost, and it ensured that the women who shaped history would remain shadows, unless we learn to hear the echoes they left behind. Long before the Vikings perfected the art of raiding, they perfected something far more calculated, the hunt for noble women. It did not begin on the battlefield. It began in whispered councils lit by firelight, where war leaders traced coastlines with their fingers and marked the places where power lived. A monastery on a cliff, a royal hall beside a river, a fortified town where a queen or princess was known to reside. These were not accidents of war, they were targets. For the Vikings, noble women were not an afterthought of conquest. They were a central strategy. Silver could be spent, land could be lost, but a woman of lineage, she carried value that multiplied with every kingdom she touched. She could be traded, ransomed, married off, used to anchor alliances, or absorbed into a new bloodline to legitimize a settlement in foreign lands. And so the hunt became an invention, systematic, refined, almost scientific. Scouts were sent ahead long before the war band arrived. They studied where the women lived, where the guards slept, where the escape routes wound behind monasteries or disappeared into forests. They learned the rhythms of prayer bells, the hours when noblewomen walked gardens, the patterns of processions and feast days. Every detail mattered. By the time a longship appeared on the horizon, the raiders already knew who they were coming for. When the attack began, chaos was the weapon. Fire drove defenders away from hidden chambers. Smoke forced women from underground refuges. Divided forces made them easier to seize. While warriors clashed in the open, selected groups slipped into sanctuaries and private quarters with a single mission: secure the women of rank. It was so methodical that some monasteries built secret tunnels not to protect treasure, but to hide abbesses and noble novices. Some royal halls created false walls around women's chambers. Some queens even traveled disguised as handmaidens to avoid recognition. But even these measures often failed. The hunt was relentless, refined over generations, passed from one Viking leader to the next like a prized craft. By the 9th century, the Norse did not merely raid for gold. They raided for legitimacy. They raided for hostages. They raided for bloodlines. And noble women, trapped between kingdoms, faiths, and ambitions, became the quiet architects of empires built through conquest. The first recorded case of a noblewoman taken by Viking hands appears not in a saga of heroes, but in a brief, almost careless line of an Irish chronicle. No name, no age, no description, only the stark note that women of rank were carried away. Yet hidden behind that single phrase stands a woman whose identity, though lost, became the blueprint for every noblewoman seized after her. She lived somewhere along the Irish coast in the early 800s, in a hall where tapestries softened stone walls and servants hurried at her command. She was likely a king's daughter, or perhaps the wife of a chieftain, someone raised to understand ceremony, diplomacy, and the fragile networks that bonded kingdoms. Her world was governed by rules of honor and lineage. Her name carried alliances. Her marriage would forge treaties. Her presence at court was a symbol of stability. But on the morning the longships appeared, those rules shattered. The attack came swiftly, as they always did, the sea erupting with oars, the air splitting with war horns. The defenders rushed to the shore, but they were outnumbered before their swords even left their scabbards. Smoke rose from the village, and chaos tore through the hall where she lived. For the first time in her life, her title could not protect her. She was taken. Not for silver, not for labor, but because she was valuable in ways only kings and war leaders understood. Her captors knew she carried prestige. They knew she could be traded, ransomed, or gifted to solidify the ambitions of men who would never speak her name. And so she vanished from her homeland, folded into the shadows of history. Her fate was never written, but her legacy endured. She became the silent prototype for 1,000 others, queens, abbesses, princesses, whose lives were rerouted by conquest. Long before sagas immortalized warriors, her story marked the true beginning of a new, hidden economy, an age where noblewomen became the currency of power. She was called a queen, though her kingdom was small, a cluster of wooden halls, a fortified church, and a few hundred loyal households. In the chronicles she appears only briefly, unnamed, but archaeology and oral memory in her region preserve her far better than parchment ever did. Her people remembered her as the woman who watched the night burn. It happened in the late 9th century, on a moonless night when the sea was black as iron. The queen had retired early, exhausted from a long council dealing with border disputes. Outside, her guards patrolled the walls, unaware that shadows were forming just beyond the reach of their torches. Viking scouts had been watching her hall for days, counting guards, mapping entrances, observing the rhythm of her retinue. When the attack came, it began without sound. The first guards died before they could shout. Flames were lit in storage barns far from the hall to draw defenders away. By the time the queen awoke, the world outside her chamber window had transformed into a chaos of orange fire and running silhouettes. She heard the screams before she saw the swords. Servants rushed her toward a hidden passage, but the raiders anticipated it. The door leading into the underground tunnel had barely opened when a figure stepped from the darkness, not a wild berserker as legends claim, but a focused hunter who had been waiting. Her protectors fought desperately, buying seconds, not minutes. Those seconds were all she had. In the smoke-choked corridor, the queen did what few captured noblewomen ever managed. She witnessed her own fall. She saw her household struggle, heard her guards shouting her name, felt the cold hand of dread tightening around her as she was dragged back toward the hall. She realized then that the raid was not random. They had not come for treasure. They had come for her. When dawn broke, the village smoldered. The queen was gone, taken across the sea, her throne empty, her lineage suddenly severed. Her people waited months for a ransom message that never arrived. Her name disappeared from records, but her story lived on in the way her descendants spoke of that night. The queen did not fall in battle. She was taken by silence. Long before Münster became a prosperous German city of merchants and scholars, it was a frontier town, a place of stone churches, wooden palisades, and a community bound tightly under the rule of its prince-bishop. It should have been safe, protected, sacred ground. But in the late 9th century, when word spread that Viking fleets had reached the North Sea again, safety became an illusion that cracked overnight. The chronicles describe a great terror falling upon Münster, but they fail to mention the spark that ignited it, the taking of the noblewomen. Among them was the bishop's niece, a woman trained in healing, diplomacy, and scripture, and two young noble sisters whose family land stretched across the surrounding countryside. Their disappearance shook the region like an earthquake. At first, the town believed they had died in the chaos of a distant raid, but months later, a message arrived carved on a thin piece of whalebone. They are alive, and they belong to us now. The letter demanded a tribute of silver larger than Münster had ever paid. The bishop called an emergency gathering in the cathedral. Nobles, clergy, landowners, warriors, all packed beneath vaulted ceilings, arguing until their voices echoed like battle cries. Some argued to pay the ransom, others insisted they should resist. But beneath every argument lay a truth none dared to speak aloud. The town could replace silver. It could not replace lineage. And so began the rebellion of Münster. It wasn't a rebellion against the Vikings, not at first, but against fear, against silence, against the law that said noblewomen stolen in raids would remain unnamed, unavenged. Young farmers volunteered to form militias. Blacksmiths forged new weapons through the night. Scouts were sent down river routes, trying to trace where the raiders had vanished. For the first time in local memory, commoners and nobles stood side by side with one purpose: to reclaim what had been taken from them. But reality struck harder than hope. After weeks of searching, a group of scouts found evidence of a Viking encampment near the marshes, fragments of foreign rope, ashes of a long-abandoned fire, and a brooch belonging to one of the noble sisters. The camp was empty. The women were already gone, sailed north to be sold, traded, or leveraged far from the lands that raised them. That discovery crushed something inside the people of Münster. Not their courage, but their illusion of agency. They had fought, prepared, rebelled against fear itself, and still they were too late. The rebellion of Münster never became a war. It became something quieter, heavier, a lesson. that no matter how fiercely a community resisted, the Viking world operated on a different clock, one where the value of a woman's lineage could alter destinies faster than any army could respond. And so Munster rebuilt its walls, tightened its defenses, and vowed never to let history repeat. But history, as always, had its own plans. By the early 11th century, the Viking Age was fading. Kings were signing treaties, trade was replacing raids, and the thunder of longships no longer shook Europe as it once had. Yet even in its final years, the old pattern did not die. It would claim one more noblewoman, the last recorded in chronicles before the age of conquest finally dimmed. She was a count's daughter from the northern coast of England, known for her intelligence, her command of languages, and her role in negotiating alliances for her family's lands. She was not a warrior, but she understood politics with a precision that made her invaluable. Her father had arranged a marriage for her to strengthen ties with a neighboring kingdom, a marriage she never lived to see. The raid that took her came not with the fury of old Viking armies, but with the precision of a dying tradition struggling to survive. A small band of seasoned raiders, no longer backed by great fleets, slipped along the coastline under cover of fog. They were relics of a former age, yet still deadly, still trained in the ancient hunt. When they reached her hall, they bypassed treasure entirely. They knew treaties were shifting across Europe, that English and Danish rulers were negotiating peace, that the future of conquest was uncertain. But one truth had not changed. A noblewoman's value could rewrite the fate of a warband. She was taken swiftly, before her guards could rally. Unlike the queens and abbesses before her, her captors did not keep her long. They sailed north to sell her to a chieftain who needed leverage in a dispute among rival clans. Her identity, her lineage, her education, her political worth, became the last echo of a system that had shaped centuries. But something unusual happened. Months later, when envoys came searching, they discovered she had not been harmed, and she had not been sold again. Instead, she had been absorbed into a household undergoing its own transformation. Her skills as a mediator, her knowledge of law, and her calm influence had shifted the balance in that distant community. She became the final noblewoman taken, and the last to quietly reshape the world around her. Her name faded from records, her legacy did not. Centuries later, long after Viking sails vanished from Europe's horizons, their legacy settled into museums, quiet halls of glass and stone, where the past waited behind velvet ropes. But in the early 20th century, a strange event shook one such museum in Norway, revealing just how unfinished the story of noblewomen truly was. The heist took place at a provincial museum near the Oslofjord, a place that housed everyday Norse artifacts, tools, combs, brooches, fragments of ships. But among the exhibits was one item rarely noticed by tourists: a small, carved wooden casket said to have been found near an ancient burial mound. It was believed to contain personal belongings of a noblewoman taken from abroad during the final centuries of Viking expansion. One fog-laced evening, the museum guard making his rounds found the display case smashed. But nothing else in the room had been touched. Not the silver, not the weapons, not even the valuable amber pieces. Only the small casket was gone. The investigation puzzled authorities. The theft was precise, purposeful. The lock had been removed without sound, the glass cut cleanly, and the intruder had moved straight to the casket as if they knew exactly what they were looking for. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed it contained letters etched on thin metal plates, perhaps the last words of a noblewoman carried from distant lands. Others whispered it held a brooch matching one found in a monastery burned centuries earlier. Whatever it contained, one fact was clear: Someone believed those forgotten women still had a voice worth stealing. The casket was never recovered, and to this day, the museum labels the empty space with a single sentence: "Artifact removed, fate unknown." Just like the women who once owned it. History remembers the Vikings for their power, their ships, their battles, their kings who carved empires from distant shores. But beneath every conquest lies a shadowed ledger, one written not in runes or silver, but in the lives of the noblewomen whose stories were never allowed to surface. For centuries, these women existed only as footnotes, captives, hostages, taken. Their names vanished, their voices smothered by the chronicles of men who recorded victories but not the human cost that purchased them. And yet their influence never disappeared. They shaped dynasties, altered bloodlines, forged alliances, and carried knowledge across continents. Even in silence, they redefined the world that tried to erase them. Today, archaeology, genetics, and recovered fragments whisper the truth louder than the old sagas ever dared. These women were not background characters. They were central to the machinery of conquest, a currency as powerful as steel, and a legacy as enduring as the societies built upon their displacement. To remember them is to rewrite the Viking Age. To honor them is to return the humanity history denied. Their voices were taken, but their impact remains unbroken, undeniable, and finally, no longer silent.